the production of a film, there's really three jobs that relate to what you hear in the final soundtrack. Three creative jobs which ultimately result in what you hear. One of them is the production recordist, which is a person who is recording during the actual filming of the movie. They'll have a microphone on the set, and they will gather dialogue and some sound effects if they're available during the actual shooting. Secondly, you'll have a sound editor, and this is a person back in a studio who generally has a collection of sound or is able to go out and make new recordings with a portable tape recorder or something like that, and bring them back and edit them and fit them into and add them onto the soundtrack of the film itself. And the third person is a sound mixer, and this is a person whose job is to blend together all the different sounds that come in to make up a soundtrack, such as music, dialogue, and sound effects. Those types of positions have really existed since sound films first came into being in one form or another. The term sound designer has gotten usage in the last decade, really since the Star Wars films began a new interest in creative soundtracks in motion pictures. A sound designer, I called myself a sound designer because I really wasn't functioning just as a production recordist or just a sound editor or just a sound mixer. I did some of the job that all three of those people might do. But I was able to follow through from the point of production of a film. That is, I could go out and advise and make suggestions about things that could be recorded once I'd seen the script of the film. I was on hand during some of the filming of the motion picture to gather sounds or at least see what was going on so I could run off myself and begin to manufacture and make sounds that I know we'd need later on. I was also on hand during the editing of the film to function as a sound editor, and that job would be to pick sounds out of a library of our own making and edit them and synchronize them with the action on the screen. And also I'd be involved in the sound mixing. And it's not often that one person gets to move through all those different jobs on a film. Usually they're pretty strictly categorized, and one person doesn't, one sound recordist may not do any sound editing, and the sound editor may not do any sound mixing. That's the tradition of the division of labor in feature films. But since I was an exception to that traditional division of labor, I needed to describe myself in some new terms. So I began to use the term sound designer, which essentially meant that although I emphasized my creative work in sound effects, my job was to coordinate all that you heard in the final soundtrack of the film. A film such as Star Wars, the soundtrack is completely fabricated in the studio. Probably on the average, 15 or 20% of the dialogue which is in the final film was originally recorded on the set during the performance by the actors. The remaining 85% of that dialogue was added later, with the actors coming back and replacing their lines of dialogue, or different actors coming in to give voices to characters or monsters or puppets or something that might be in the show. All of the sound effects you hear in the film are added later, everything from footsteps to cloth rustle to the handling of props to the sound of vehicles, weapons, aliens, and exploding Death Stars. Those are all things which didn't exist at the time of shooting. They had to be manufactured after the fact. And of course the music wasn't there during the original shooting. So all the elements which go into the final soundtrack there's thousands of them, really. And to keep track of it all, one has to come up with a system of identifying each sound, of giving it a name, giving it a description. And so as a sound designer, one of the things you do is to collect a lot of sound, categorize it, and you keep tapes on your shelf, or nowadays sound stored on a computer disk. And it's very much like an encyclopedia. You have hundreds and hundreds of sounds. I think I have 6,000 tapes in say, accumulated over 12 years of just sound design work. And that is a result of going out and recording lots of material, animals, aircraft carriers, jets, appliance motors, whatever it might be, bringing them back, and you need to actually select from those tapes the things you find the most interesting and categorize them and put it down on a list so you can read it and find things later, because your memory can't often hang on to every little detail. And so you need to somehow make a catalog of sound which you can refer to when you're on the hunt for something specifically. So part of being a sound designer is being a librarian, really, and collecting a lot of data and having it arranged in an organized way such that you or the people you're working with, the other editors or sound people, can find things in this encyclopedia of sound. When I did Star Wars, it was the very beginning of my career, and I had a lot to learn. In fact, I knew very little, and so everything I did at that time was going down a new road to some extent. And just completing the film was a major goal and a source of a great deal of energy and stress and so on. When it came time to work on Empire, I felt, based on the experience that I had had on Star Wars, the experience I had gotten, the feedback I had gotten, I had learned from you make mistakes and you look at the things that are wrong with one film and you say, well, now next time I'm going to learn, I'll do better. We had very high expectations for Empire, and so stylistically, I wasn't attempting to do something really different, but I was attempting to do the same thing on a much grander scale, because I knew what I was up against. The film was filled with a lot more new things. I wasn't going to just take the library of material made for the first film and just copy it over and use it again. I had all the same characters, and they did different things. The Wookiee said new things. R2 had a large part to play. We had all kinds of new vehicles and machinery and different. We only had, the first film had one kind of TIE fighter, and Empire had 3 different kinds. And we had quite a range of spaceships to deal with, so they all needed different and new sounds. So Empire was just doing the same job on a grander scale, with perhaps even higher expectations. A lot of what was done on Star Wars was done in a kind of innocence. Those of us that worked on it were interested in fantasy or science fiction movies. We had did not anticipate the film would be generally popular. We thought maybe we'd please the science fiction fans that we knew and friends and this sort of thing. We didn't know it would become a sort of worldwide phenomenon. So when it came to doing Empire, we did feel, and I know I did, great pressure now that you had to succeed and do something on a much higher level in order to get the same effect. And so it's a great deal of creative pressure to just outdo ourselves. And so on Empire, we did a lot more field recording. We went out and tried to record something new and original for practically everything. And a lot more time was spent mixing in stereo. The concept for the sound of Darth Vader came about from the first film, and the script described him as some kind of a strange dark being who was in some kind of life support system, that he was breathing strange, that maybe you heard sounds of mechanics or motors. He might be part robot, he might be part human, we really didn't know. And so the original concept I had of Darth Vader was a very noise-producing individual. He came into a scene, he was breathing like some wheezing windmill. You could hear his heart beating. He moved his head, you heard motors turning. He was almost like some kind of a robot in some sense. And he made so much noise that we had to sort of cut back on that concept. In the first experimental mixes we did in Star Wars, he sounded like an operating room, like an emergency room, moving around.
All right, don't lose your temper. I'll come right back and give you a hand.
Chewie was actually the first voice that I was hired to work on back when Star Wars was just in the script stage. They knew they had this character named Chewbacca who was going to have to act and appear in scenes with the other actors. And the question was, what would he sound like? He's not going to speak English. He's going to speak some sort of alien, animal type of voice. It's supposed to be an intelligent language, but not English and not German, not French, not something we'd really recognize. It had to be something made out of animal sound. One of the first meetings I had with George Lucas, we talked this over, and he said something about, well, maybe bears would sound good. He had heard some recording maybe somewhere of bears growling and making vocalizations. didn't say where that was, but he said that'd be one of the things you might look into, and we had a list of different animals to go out and record. So in the sort of year I spent recording preliminary sounds for Star Wars, I collected lots of bear sounds, as well as walruses and lions and badgers and sick animals and, you know, domestic, all sorts of things. And out of all these recordings, you could extract little bits of sound, little grunts and moans and ughs and args and purring sounds, whatever it might be. And I collected and put all on one tape, essentially, all these sounds which I thought had emotional feelings associated with them. You play this sound, it sounded affectionate. You played this other sound, it sounded angry. And in that manner, I kind of had these categories of little sounds that each had an emotional tone associated with it. So I began cutting those together to try to get a sense of speech out of Chewie, and to also get something that would work well with the way his mouth moved. He didn't have articulated lips. He could basically open and close his mouth. So you also needed to create a sound which would be believable as coming from a mouth which was operating like his did. And through a great deal of trial and error, came up with a voice for Chewbacca in that fashion. So it's a voice which is manufactured completely out of animal sounds, principally bears, and synchronized with the performance that's shot during filming. R2-D2 was probably the most difficult voice to work on because it was the most abstract. Here we had supposedly a machine that was going to talk, it was going to act, it was going to draw on our emotions, it was going to be in scenes with Alec Guinness and work as another actor, yet it was a machine. It didn't have a face with a smile or a mouth or eyes or ears, and it couldn't speak English, and it couldn't even mouth words. At least Chewbacca could make kind of animal sounds which you could attribute a personality to. The initial experiments in coming up with R2's voice were all directed toward making a machine type of language, something that would come out of a computer, out of a robot. And although the voices were very interesting, I think, which I made, they all seemed to lack a sort of human quality. They seemed too machine-like. And R2 was not really just a machine. He was also this lovable little assistant robot. And it came about after trial and error and trying different sounds that one day I just started making the sounds. I said, well, maybe R2 should kind of sound like this, and you'd imitate a little baby sound, ooh, ah, you know, something like that. It's a sound you might have heard a little infant making when they were learning to talk. Communicating some kind of emotion, but not using well-formed English words. So the idea came up to really combine this sort of human sound with the electronic sound. That way we'd still might be able to have the character of a machine, but get the personality and the emotion of a living organism. So I learned to combine my voice with electronic sounds, which I would play on the keyboard of a synthesizer. And in combining the two, I was able to get a sense of performance out of the character, and to get some emotion into the sounds that R2 made, because you could put an inflection and intonation on the voice, and yet you were using non-word sounds to communicate. So it is just a process of trial and error of getting that, and it eventually just clicked in. The lightsabers are one of my favorite sounds, and in fact, it was the very first sound I made for the whole series. For some reason, after I read the script, even though my assignment was first to find a voice for Chewbacca and then a voice for R2, and then, well, maybe come up with some sounds for laser guns and other things, the lightsaber fascinated me. At that time, when the script had first come out, they had some paintings that Ralph McQuarrie had done, so that there were some concepts visually of what some of these things would look like. And those pictures were very inspiring because they gave an idea of the direction we were trying to go in the look of the film, and it was inspiring to me to therefore think up sounds that might fit that kind of visual style. And I could kind of hear the sound in my head of the lightsabers, even though you just a painting of a lightsaber. I could really just sort of hear the sound. I think maybe somewhere in my subconscious I had seen a lightsaber before. And I went to, at that time I was still a graduate student at USC, and I was a projectionist, and we had a projection booth with some very, very old simplex projectors in them. And they had an interlock motor which connected them to the system, which, when they just sat there and idled, made a wonderful humming sound. And it would slowly change in pitch, and it would beat against another motor. There were two motors, and they would harmonize with each other. And it was kind of that inspiration. That sound was the inspiration for the lightsaber, and I went and recorded that sound. But it wasn't quite enough. It was just a humming sound. What was missing was kind of a buzzy, sparkling sound, the scintillating element which I was looking for. And that I found one day by accident. I was carrying a microphone across the room between recording. I was recording something over here, and I walked over here with the microphone, passed by a television set, which was on the floor, which was on at the time, without the sound turned up, but the microphone passed right behind the picture tube, and as it did, this particular microphone produced an unusual hum. It picked up transmission from the television set, and a signal was induced into its sound reproducing mechanism. And that was a great buzz, actually. So I took that buzz, recorded it, and combined it with the projector motor sound, and that, the 50-50 kind of combination of those two sounds became the basic lightsaber tone, which was then, once we had established this tone of the lightsaber, of course you had to get the sense of the lightsaber moving, because characters would carry it around, they'd whip it through the air, they would, of course, thrust and slash at each other in fights. And to achieve this additional sense of movement, I played the sound over a speaker in a room, just the humming sound, the humming and buzzing combined is an endless sound, and then took another microphone and waved it around in the air next to that speaker so that it would come close to the speaker and go away. You could whip it by. And what happens when you do that by recording with a moving microphone is you get a Doppler shift, you get a pitch shift in the sound, and therefore you can produce a very authentic facsimile of a moving sound, and therefore it gave the lightsaber a sense of movement, and it worked well on screen at that point. The walkers were a lot of fun to work on because they were big mechanical beasts, and it was a pleasure sometimes to work on just big machinery rather than just voices. And we knew the walkers were big and they were heavy and they were lumbering about, and because they were animated they had a certain rhythmic walk to them, and so the objective was to come up with a sound for the walkers to give them a real sense of mass and weight. After all, they were miniatures and they were being animated, and one of the things about one of the drawbacks of animation is that it's hard to produce a sense of mass in an object. You know, if you want something to seem like it's many tons or the size of a building, it takes particularly good animation in order to create that sense of weight, but we can help that along a great deal with the proper sound. So the walker was made up of different elements. It had motors, and it had metal clunks, and it had a weapon sound. The principal sound of a foot stomping along, this very big metallic clang with kind of a rattle and a winkle to it, was the sound of a metal shearing machine, which is a big stamping machine in a factory which rolls of metal come out of a conveyor belt that just cuts them off into pieces. It's like a big chopping block for iron and steel. And Randy Tom, one of the fellows working with me at that time, he went out and recorded some of these metal shearing machines for me. He brought the recordings in. I picked parts of the recordings that I liked and made them into a rhythmic walk cycle. But in addition to just the metal shearing machine clanging along, I needed some big metallic squeaking sounds, kind of like the knee joint squeaking all the time. Every time it would lift its leg, there'd be a big sort of a moaning sound. And that I achieved by playing with the dumpster door, a dumpster that was dropped off at my house one day filled in the street to be filled with trash. I'd go out and throw the trash in it, and I'd open the lid, and it made this wonderful sound because it hadn't been oiled in its entire life. And so that dumpster became a major part of the walker as well. The sound of explosions has always been a great passion for me. And so when it came to battle scenes or the destruction of the Death Star or anything of that sort, I always got into it quite seriously and spent a lot of time recording explosions and weapons and trying to figure out ways to record them to get the maximum visceral effect out of the event. Real explosions are very difficult to record because they're so loud and quite often they're so sudden, short in duration of sound that a normal recording system doesn't get something that's very interesting. It gets a big clap or a big pop or something of that sort. If you listen to explosions often on the news, things recorded in actual warfare, sometimes it doesn't seem to have quite the body and the tone range that you are used to hearing in motion pictures. I went out and did a lot of recording of explosions. I went to White Sands Missile Range to record missiles and rockets taking off and impacting and air-to-air interceptions. I went to many military bases and recorded tanks shooting and artillery. I got myself in a situation once where I was being bombarded by howitzers from about 5 miles away, and I was in a trench and they were dropping shells 500 feet out in front of me where my microphones were. Blew up one pair of microphones, cut cables, put some more out, ducked shrapnel, but got some great recordings, and I've repeated that experience over and over again over the years, always in a quest which I call the search for the ultimate explosion. And I've gone a great distance in this, but I don't know if I've gotten it yet.
At one time, there was like no decisions how to do any of this stuff, and all there were these wonderful color artworks that Ralph had done of the big walking machines. So we had to figure out how we're going to do this, and one of the thoughts was to make a robot. We're going to make a complete robotic one that would actually kind of move by itself, a walking machine maybe 5 feet tall or something like that. And that seemed like it could be very complicated and very expensive to do, but my background is before Star Wars was really in stop motion animation. And I'd seen King Kong when I was a kid and all. And so I pushed to do it in stop motion because they're machines anyway, and if they move sort of like a little staccato-like, it would just make them look more like machines. So we did it in stop motion. And we did it with models that were as big as a person could animate, which is about the size that a person can get their hands in to move it frame at a time. And we did it in front of big paintings that were, instead of blue screen compositing, paintings that were done to look like the sky, but painted so realistically you thought they were actually outdoors. The sets that were built were baking soda, and with trap doors in them so the animators could pop up, animate the figure, and go back down, and you could shoot a frame of film. And at 24 frames a second, we sometimes we'd get a shot a day if we were doing real good, which is like a 5-second shot. So we had scales that were like 5 foot or 4 foot tall one for scenes when it sort of blew up, some part of it blew up and it had to fall over. Those were done with high-speed photography. And we had some photo cutouts that were in the backgrounds, or sometimes when you see about 6 or 7 of them, and the ones in the background are just Polaroid photo cutouts that are sort of animated. And then we have little tiny ones that we used for the very opening shot, I think when you see them, or some of the speeder shots when you see them off in the distance, real tiny ones off in the distance there. And we just made them as small as we could possibly make them to do it. So we had lots of different scales that we mixed and matched depending on the shot. The third one, I think it seemed to me that it had a lot shorter time frame to do it in. The second one was by far the most difficult of all of them to work on. But the third one had a very, this sort of a tighter production schedule with a lot more shots, and I suppose they were a lot more action oriented also. But it wasn't, I didn't have any sort of sense that here's the third film, and it's going to be, everything's going to have to be faster than anything we'd done before, although it sort of came out that way in doing it. And, it was just a big, huge, massive, project like the other two. But I think we got a lot better, and I think that shows up in the show. I think there's, there's a sense of roughness in the first one, and even to a certain extent in the second one, that I think is pretty much gone in the third one. We figured this stuff out, and all the energy could go into the creation of the images, not fighting the technology to make those images. Programming the spaceships in the Star Wars films, I thought sort of really about what the attitude of the pilot might be. And some of them, you don't spend a lot of time thinking about this, but you can add like a skid to the motion of a spaceship when it's going around a turn that you see and you sense it, and it looks better because you've seen race cars in Indianapolis skid around a turn, and it just looks really nice. So you put stuff like that into it, and you can relate to it, and it just, it adds another level of connection to it, so that the audience can relate. Oh yeah, that's right. That's not only right, that's really neat. By the time we got to the third one, there was a lot more of each of those. We had the redwoods and the outer space and the desert. And those were each a completely different geography that we had to deal with. And there was more that took place within, I think, each of those geographies than took place in the first one. I think one of the biggest things of the Star Wars films that's distinguished it from the other films we were doing at the same time was that you'd have this one film that had all these different locations in them that you had to work in, and you had to solve all these sets of problems. It's like for Dragon Slayer, once we kind of solved the go motion problem, we could do it for all the shots, and it was pretty much, we could figure it out. For E.T., once we figured out how to fly the bicycles, we're fine, we can do it for all the shots we need. But, once you figured out, how the walkers are going to walk, then you've got to figure out still how the Tauntaun is going to be moving around, because it's a completely different type of character, and then how you're going to have, the speeder bikes working. Each show had all these different, just a much bigger selection of problems in them that needed solving. There was quite an effort to keep the cost down on this show. No matter how big it looks, it's always too expensive. And Dragon Slayer had been pretty expensive to do, the go motion stuff and that, and we were looking for another way to do this sort of creatures that were cheaper. And we thought about rod puppets. But we wanted to try, George wanted to try, and we thought, okay, we'll give it a try. A guy in a suit, if we could make the suit interesting enough. So Phil Tippett came up with an interesting idea where you've got, I think there's a person in the middle of the suit, but you've got another guy on the left, and another whose right arm is and the guy on the right whose left arm is in it. And if you can mat all those people out, you get a shape, a moving shape that is nothing that a person could ever do in a suit. So it would look a lot more unique and interesting. But it didn't quite make it. When it was all said and done, it still looked like it didn't move right. It's got all the problems with sort of, with big suit things that have to react to gravity and things that are just like tip-offs to, they're like Muppets. They're like just big Muppets, and people are so used to what those type of puppets look like that, because you're playing with them by the time you're a year old, that you just can't fool people and that stuff. So instead we went with the rod puppets, and we made a figure probably about this tall, about 18 inches, and it was all worked from below. The head and all was cable actuator from below. The arms were controlled from around the elbows, going out below. It was in a miniature set with probably about 4 or 5 puppeteers, and and the camera guys. We were just like jammed right up against it, shooting it. And we did it sort of as a live-action shoot. We shot high speed, though. Sometimes we shot backwards. Anything that we could do to get it away from that, again, that sort of Muppet rod puppet look. And we'd go. So I think there were maybe a couple of scenes that were shot undercranked also. Whatever we could do, and then Mark was pretty much either split screened in to it from the set done over in England, or he was blue screened into the foreground on that. So there's a lot of cheats in that shot. I mean, in that sequence. And if you don't ever quite see the whole character, and you don't see it quite walking. But for the film and for that point in it, it was just, it was fine for it. And it didn't really need to show any more than what it did. Dealing with the real redwoods, which we were, because we had all the actors shooting all the plates, in a lot of ways made it, it's always easier to do it because we could visualize 99% of the shot. All you had to do was like just visualize where the walker was going to be and what its behavior was going to be in the shot. That was a lot of fun shooting that stuff up in Northern California, and with all the pyro charges in the trees and everything going off, and we had multiple cameras shooting the big moments when everything would happen. It was just, it was really spectacular, and then going through all the footage and finding the bits and pieces, that George was going to use for the stuff was really, really pretty neat. The bike chase sequence was a whole different set of problems, and that was like racing through it at 100 miles an hour. And there's no way to do that. We could go along a road, but how do you get rid of the road? And you can run, but you can't run 100 miles an hour or a motorcycle and you'd crash. So that was a different thing. I really, in my mind, treated that as a completely different thing than any of than the Walker sequence. At the beginning of the sequence, the original conception of it, George asked Joe and I to figure out he said, well, here's the beginning of the sequence, and here's the end, and you guys kind of, do what you want for the middle and let me know what you got. So we started thinking about it. We did some storyboards on it, and came up with quite a bit of it. And then George looked at that and said, no, that's a good start, but. And then he went and refined it and made it, this big, elaborate sequence that it is right now, that was so big that it was hard to even figure out where to begin orchestrating how you're going to make this sequence, because again, it's like 105 shots in 3 minutes. And you've got side views and forward and backwards and explosions and, tracking shots and locked off shots, and it's just a huge thing. But the setting is kind of basically sort of the same. So what we did was we did an animatic on it, which was a little version of it with a brand new camera that had just come out, a little video camera that was like only about this big, with a little lens on it. Now they're all over the place, but at this point there wasn't anything really that small. And we did the whole thing on videotape with little model dolls. We had dolls about this big and made little plastic bikes like this and had rods coming out of the back of them, and set up on a table, a 4x8 sheet of plywood, a fur rug that we got from a local fabric store, and some cardboard tubes for the redwood trees, and a couple of lights to light them, and then sort of held these as like little toys. And you could hold a camera then in the other hand. The camera wasn't this big, camera for shooting video. It was a small, lightweight one, so that it could be as flexible as the scene needed to be, because the scene had to be really flexible. And we did, over a period of like 2 or 3 days, we did an animatic, which is essentially the film. And you can compare it to what's in the film, and they look, almost exactly the same. Now that we were out of the storyboard stage and we had visuals to look at, and everybody agreed, yeah, the visual of it, the running footage of this looks really good, then we could break it down into how many shots we had looking to the front, how many shots looking to the back, to the left, to the right, how many were like one-off shots, and then we could schedule it. We thought at the beginning about building a miniature forest that we could race through, motion control, but in order to be able to just get the speed, because the idea behind it was incredible sense of speed, plus there was a huge number of shots. It was like, it's 105 shots in 3 minutes. There's an incredible amount of work in that little self-contained sequence. But I decided to try a test, and we shot it right at the Samuel Taylor Park here in Murren County, of a Steadicam, which is a device that Garrett Brown made years ago, and I actually had Garrett fly out, and we did a test of just walking through, shooting it at a very slow frame rate of 1 frame a second, and the Steadicam sort of stabilizes the camera as he's walking through, and then he has to kind of think very slowly about what a pan to the right, or like racing around a corner would be, and very slowly navigate the Steadicam around like this corner. So you don't move quickly like you're driving a car, you kind of look ahead 300 feet, and now you begin this slow embankment as you're walking toward that very slow. And when you project it at normal speed, it's got this incredible sense of speed. So we started, so once we had the technology worked out as to how to do the backgrounds, then the whole sequence got a lot simpler. And we didn't have to focus our attention to building these big models. We built small models probably about this long, for the sort of medium shots and longer shots of the guys on the bikes. And we shot those on motion control, but at a very slow camera speed, with our first sort of experiments we got into in rod puppets that we literally later in the show used a lot more in the Rancor sequence, and which means you can sort of grab a rod coming out of Luke's back and out of his helmet and moving again very slowly as the camera is shooting 1 frame a second. You can get some good choreography of the characters, making them look like they're on the bikes, because their hands are sort of attached, their rear ends are attached, their legs are attached, but all these joints, if they're free and flexible, can move around. It look like they're sort of moving around there.
Originally, to get things choreographed and designed correctly, what we did for the first space battle, the first big space battle, is we shot on tape using models, very simplistic models on sticks shot against Ultimat blue screen. We shot our own version of the space battle, matting in ships against little drawings of backgrounds we would do, and really funky cardboard cutouts of things, and we would mat in like the Millennium Falcon on top of some other ships we would put in, and you can see the sticks in the shots and all that. George took all that material and cut it together. Actually, I think we took the first space battle and did our own cut, and then we sat down, every one of us that was involved, and did our own sound effects for it. So as the ships are going around, we'd be just using our mouths and just faking it. And apparently it went over real well. I was hoping it would be in the movie, but I guess not. It was fun doing that because it didn't have to be as precise and as time-consuming as the real shots had to be. So George took that, he cut the sequences, and cut that around the live-action footage that he already had. And based on that, we would set up the real models and start shooting away.